Meanwhile, Wright's previous saying that Donald Trump acknowledges that Russia had a role in the election in a hack attack, but that it didn't affect the outcome of the election. Of course, to hear all these reports, you'd think it did. But former CIA operations officer Bryan Wright says there is a risk to dragging this out too long. The risk, I think Bryan is right there now, but I don't know what can be done now. I mean, Donald Trump has, grudgingly or not, accepted the fact that the Russians were trying to monkey around in our election. Do you think the Russians influenced the final outcome?
I think perhaps on the margins, but I think proving it is extraordinarily difficult. I can tell you from personal experience that these kinds of operations are very, very tough to not only pull off, but then gauge. So I don't think that there was a result that the American people were influenced, frankly, in a profound way. And I think what President Obama said the day after the election, that the will of the American people was captured in the vote, I think that frankly, is the most important takeaway. That being said, there is no doubt, there is no question that the Russians were meddling, that they hacked and smacked our democracy, and we have to respond accordingly. There needs to be some kind of thoughtful, consistent response.
Here's what worries me, though, about the president-elect, Bryan, and you're closer to this. But the fact that he wants good relations with Vladimir Putin, or has spoken highly of him during the campaign, and Putin of Trump, it almost makes it impossible to have a typical suspect view of the Russians coming in, and when there's history to suggest we should.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's as much as we want to have a thoughtful relationship with the Russians, and we need one in a place like Syria, and we can acknowledge some of the critiques that Putin has levied at us, like in the Ukraine, for instance. If we don't sit back and acknowledge collectively, that is the president-elect and members of Congress, in a thoughtful way to say, listen, this did happen, this is true, the Russians did hack and attack our democracy. Here are ways that we can fight back. I think covert action is an important one. But I hear the point that if we have sort of our egos getting in the way from the president-elect on down, then that's going to prevent us from pushing back against the Russians in an appropriate and commiserate way.
Isn't the fault, and I think the president has acknowledged this, that he didn't appreciate the degree of this hacking problem and its enormity until quite later, and that he bears some blame in this happening in the first place. But that we're there now. So for Donald Trump coming in as president about a week and a half, what should he do? How do we lock things up to make sure this doesn't happen again? Because let's say the administration falls out of favor of the new one with the Russians, it could happen all over again.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. So President Obama signed what's called a finding that allows for the CIA and NSA to move forward with covert action operations to respond in a commiserate way. And I think that those targets have been set up, and I think you'll see in the coming weeks and months that the Trump administration facing the option of whether or not to execute those operations that are being built. But the second piece that I think and I'll give President Trump some degree of credit for here, is that he needs to sit down with Putin and say, listen, the past is the past. We do need to move forward. That doesn't mean that I'm going to pretend like he didn't run into my front yard and steal my kid's bike, which is effectively what Putin did with our democracy and stealing the DNC's records and such. But we can and should be doing things differently in Syria. I mean, as a CIA guy, frankly, as a Democrat, I think that we have really messed up for the past number of years in Syria. So I think that there are really good ways to work with Putin. But let there be no doubt, inside of Russia, they are persecuting, journalists and minorities. And you need to have a thoughtful understanding that is happening, because if not, you're not going to push back in an aggressive way, and we need to.
Yeah, they're not our buddies, to put it mildly. Bryan Wright, thank you, former CIA operations officer.